Most histories of the apartheid's end focus on Nelson Mandela, or Robben Island, on the township uprisings, on international sanctions, and the moral weight of the global anti-apartheid movement. All of these things matter, but there is another part of the story, fought in the red dust of Angola and the flat thorn bush of Namibia, far from the cameras, and the protest, and the Nobel Prizes, that has never quite received the attention it deserves. For 23 years, the South African Defense Force fought a grinding, escalating, ultimately unwinnable war along its northern borders. It started as a counterinsurgency against the Namibian liberation movement. It became a full-scale conventional war involving Cuba, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the largest military engagement on African soil since the Second World War. And when it ended, when South Africa finally withdrew from Angola and acknowledged Namibian independence, the apartheid state withdrew something else too: the confidence, the military myth, the belief, along with the white South African public and the Afrikaner leadership, that the regime's survival could be guaranteed by force. Oliver Tambo, the leader of the African National Congress, called the battle that finally broke that myth the Waterloo of racist South Africa. He was not wrong. South Africa in the 1960s was a country under pressure from every direction. The United Nations had condemned apartheid. African nations that had once been under European colonial rule were gaining independence and providing bases for the liberation movement, fighting South African rule in Namibia and South Africa itself. And the apartheid government had a framework for understanding all of it, a framework called Total Onslaught. Total Onslaught was the theory that South Africa was the target of a coordinated communist campaign, directed from Moscow, working through the African National Congress and SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization, fighting for Namibian independence, to destroy white minority rule. The theory was partly true and largely exaggerated. The Soviets were backing both movements. Cuba would eventually deploy tens of thousands of troops to Angola in South Africa's conflict zone. These were real facts. The framework of an existential global communist conspiracy was an exaggeration layered on top of them, but it served a political purpose. Framing the border wars as South Africa's front line against communism achieved two things. It justified military spending and conscription to the white South African public, and it attracted American support at a time when Washington was deeply anxious about Soviet expansion in Africa. The immediate trigger was Namibia, Southwest Africa as South Africans called it. South Africa had administrated the territory since taking it from Germany in 1915 during World War I. It had extended apartheid there as thoroughly as it had at home. The SWAPO had been formed in 1960 to fight for independence. When diplomacy and legal efforts through the United Nations produced nothing, SWAPO formed a military wing, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, PLAN, and in August 1966, PLAN fighters attacked Portuguese trading stores in southern Angola. The South African border war had begun. For the first decade, it was manageable. SWAPO was small, lightly armed, and operating from bases in Zambia. The South African security forces were vastly better equipped and contained the insurgency. But in 1974, everything changed. Portugal's colonial empire collapsed overnight. The new left-wing Portuguese government withdrew from Angola, leaving a power vacuum in which three armed factions immediately moved. One of them, the MPLA, backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, ultimately took power in Luanda. And the MPLA gave SWAPO something it never had before: a massive, friendly, well-equipped northern neighbor directly bordering Namibia. The border war became a regional war, and South Africa decided it needed to fight it as one. South Africa's war in Angola was not a secret. It was reported. It was known in broad outline. It was discussed in Parliament. What was kept from South African public was the scale, the cost, the truth of what was happening on the ground. In 1975, South Africa launched Operation Savannah, a full-scale conventional military intervention in the Angolan Civil War, driving north towards Luanda alongside UNITA rebels in an attempt to prevent the Cuban-backed MPLA from taking power. The column got within range of Luanda. Then the Americans, who had encouraged South Africa to intervene, lost their nerves. Congress passed legislation blocking further US involvement in Angola. South Africa was left exposed, withdrew, and watched MPLA consolidate power with Cuban military support. The lesson South Africa drew was the wrong one. Not that unilateral military adventure in Angola was unwinnable, but the next time they needed American support locked in before they committed. Through the late 1970s and 1980s, South Africa conducted a series of massive military operations, driving deep into Angola to destroy SWAPO's forward operating bases. The operations were military successful in narrow tactical terms. SWAPO's bases were destroyed, its Crandalls killed and forced north, but each destroyed base was rebuilt. Each operation produced more SWAPO recruits from the Namibians, who watched their homeland bombed and invaded. And each operation entrenched South Africa deeper in a war it had no exit strategy for. The South African conscripts who fought these operations were not professional soldiers. They were 18 and 19-year-old white South African men doing conscriptory national service. 2 years initially, with regular reserve call-outs for years afterwards. They were told they were fighting communism on South Africa's border. Many of them came home with what the army called negative states, PTSD in everything but name, and they were told to say nothing of what they had seen. The war was being fought, and the white South African public was being asked to support it, without being fully told what it was or what it would cost. Through the early 1980s, that worked. But by the late 1980s, it was starting to break down. In 1987, the Angolan Government Army, the FAPLA, launched another offense against UNITA's strongholds in southeast Angola. South Africa intervened again, as it had before, stopping the offense at the Lombo River in a series of engagements in September and October 1987 that destroyed several Angolan bridges. FAPLA fell back to the town of Cuito Cuanavale. South Africa and the UNITA followed, besieged the town. What happened next changed the war. Fidel Castro made a decision that South Africa had not anticipated. Rather than allow Cuito Cuanavale to fall and lose everything Cuba had invested into Angola over a decade, Castro decided to massively reinforce. Between December 1987 and March 1988, Cuba poured 50,000 additional troops into Angola, bringing its total force to 55,000 men. More critically, Cuba deployed advanced MiG-23 aircraft and sophisticated anti-aircraft systems that fundamentally changed the air balance over southern Angola. The South African Defense Force had operated with effective air superiority throughout the border war. Its Mirage and Impala aircraft had been able to strike SWAPO and FAPLA positions with relative freedom. That superiority ended with the Cuban reinforcements. South African pilots began encountering MiG-23s they could not outmatch, and anti-aircraft defenses they could not easily suppress. South Africa launched 3 major assaults on Cuito Cuanavale, in January, February, and March 1988. All three were repulsed. The town did not fall. And simultaneously, Cuba moved a powerful Western force towards the Namibian border, a direct threat to South Africa's control of the territory it was fighting the entire war to protect. The military outcome of Cuito Cuanavale is fiercely disputed. South Africa insists it was never defeated, that its forces held their objectives, and that the battle was a tactical stalemate. Cuba and Angola claim a decisive Cuban-Angolan victory. Nelson Mandela, who was still imprisoned on Robben Island when this happened, later said, "The defeat of the apartheid army was an inspiration to the struggling people of South Africa, and to all Africa." Objectively, military historians have generally concluded the battle was a strategic stalemate in tactical terms, but that the strategic consequences were entirely in Cuba's favor. South Africa found itself facing a conventional military threat on the Namibian border that it could not easily counter, at a cost it could not sustain, in a war the white public was losing patience with. The Tripartite Accord was signed on December 1988. South Africa agreed to withdraw from Angola and implement UN Resolution 435 on Namibia independence. Cuba agreed to withdraw its forces from Angola. The deal was brokered by the United States, the same United States that had quietly supported South Africa's intervention while publicly maintaining arms embargo compliance. Namibia became independent on March 21, 1990. SWAPO Sam Nujoma, who had run the liberation movement from exile for 3 decades, became its first president. South Africa had fought for 23 years to prevent exactly this outcome. It had failed. To understand how the border wars broke apartheid, you have to understand how they worked on the white South African public, the constitutionality the regime needed to maintain order to survive. Apartheid rested on a compact with white South Africans. We provide you security, prosperity, and separation from the black majority. In exchange, you support the system. Through the 1960s and into the 1970s, that compact held. The economy grew, white living standards were high. The military appeared in control of the borders. The black population was suppressed. The border wars slowly dismantled that compact from multiple directions, simultaneously. The financial cost was staggering. South Africa's defense budget consumed an ever-growing share of government spending through the 1970s and 1980s, money being spent in Angola rather than on infrastructure and services that maintained white South Africa's quality of life. By the late 1980s, military spending combined with the economic damage of internal sanctions had produced serious economic deterioration. The rand collapsed in value. Inflation rose. The prosperity that was the system's central promise had eroded. Then there was the conscripts, 500,000 white South African men who had served in or adjacent to the war zone. Many had seen things they couldn't speak about, classified operations, the reality of what the war entitled. And what had come home changed. The End Conscription Campaign, formed in 1983, began organizing white South African men to resist call-ups. Some refused and went to prison. The movement was small, but its existence was significant. White South Africans were publicly refusing to fight the government's war. Cuito Cuanavale made all this worse. The military myth, the South African Defense Force was an invincible force protecting South Africa from communism, had been central to the regime's legitimacy. When the battle ended in a withdrawal and a negotiation settlement that gave Namibia its independence anyways, the myth was punctured. South Africa had spent 23 years and enormous blood and treasure to prevent Namibian independence. It had achieved nothing. The strategic logic of the border wars had always been that the military success in the north would buy time and space for the apartheid system to survive. By 1989, that logic had collapsed. The Cubans and the Soviets had matched South Africa militarily. The economic cost was becoming unsustainable. The white public was tiring, and the ANC's internal resistance, the Township Uprising of 1976 and 1985, had demonstrated that the black population would not be permanently suppressed. F.W. de Klerk took power in August 1989. He was not a reformer by conviction. He was a pragmatist who could read the strategic situation his predecessors had created. The military had not secured apartheid. International isolation was deepening. The economy was deteriorating. And Cuito Cuanavale had demonstrated that even military superiority could not be assumed. On February 2, 1990, de Klerk stood before the South African Parliament and announced the unbanning of the ANC and the release of Nelson Mandela. 9 days later, Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison after 27 years. The South African border wars killed approximately 2,000 South African soldiers, roughly 12,000 SWAPO fighters, and tens of thousands of Angolan citizens caught in the war between the large powers. It consumed hundreds of billions of rand in military spending. It conscripted 500,000 young white South African men, many of whom came home with wounds, physical and psychological, that the government preferred not to acknowledge. What it achieved, strategically, is one of history's most bitter ironies. South Africa fought for 23 years to prevent a communist-backed liberation movement from taking power in Namibia. It failed. SWAPO governed Namibia from independence in 1990 and has governed it continuously since. The MPLA, which South Africa fought to undermine in Angola, remained in power. The Soviet Union, whose global ambitions have provided the ideological framework for Total Onslaught, collapsed in 1991, making the entire doctrine retrospectively moot. But the border wars did something their architects did not intend. They accelerated the end of apartheid itself. The military cost, the economic drain, the demoralization of the white conscript generation, the puncturing of the SADF's invincibility myth at Cuito Cuanavale, all of it combined with the internal resistance and international pressure to produce a government that, by 1989, understood it could not continue. Nelson Mandela understood the connection. When he was released in February 1990, one of his first public statements honored the Cuban forces that had fought in Angola. The Cuban people hold a special place in the heart of the people of Africa, he said. The Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom, and justice, unparalleled for its principle and selfless character. It was a statement that many in Washington found uncomfortable, but Mandela was making a very specific historical argument. The battle that broke the apartheid regime's military confidence had been fought with Cuban soldiers, Soviet weapons, and the liberation movements of southern Africa, not by the superpowers whose diplomacy eventually managed the transition, but by the men and women who had died in Angola bush for a cause they believed in. Apartheid did not fall from the outside. It was hollowed out from within, by its own wars, its own cost, its own contradictions. The border wars were one of those instruments of that hollowing. Not the only one, but one of the decisive ones. The war that ended apartheid was the war that the apartheid government had been fighting to save itself.